The fever had taken hold 3 days ago, and Lydia Jensen knew she was dying alone in the mountain cabin, while her husband was 200 miles away working a cattle drive that would not return until autumn. She pressed a trembling hand to her burning forehead and whispered a prayer into the darkness, wondering if anyone would find her body before the winter snows came to bury it beneath 6 feet of white silence. The window showed nothing but towering pines and jagged peaks, the nearest neighbor 15 miles down a treacherous trail that wound through wilderness so thick a man could disappear into it and never be found. Her name was Lydia Jensen, 23 years old, married for 2 years to a good man who had promised her a life of adventure in the Utah Territory. They had built this cabin together in the spring of 1876, hauling logs and driving nails until their hands bled, laughing at their own incompetence and learning as they went. The cabin sat at the edge of Taylorsville, a settlement so small it barely warranted the name, just a trading post and a handful of scattered homesteads connected by rough trails that turned to mud in the spring and froze solid in the winter. The nearest doctor was in Salt Lake City, 3 days' ride through mountain passes that could kill a man if he did not know what he was doing. Lydia had been gathering wild herbs near the creek when the fever started, a sudden chill that raced through her body despite the summer heat. By nightfall she could barely stand, and by the second day she had stopped trying. The fever dreams came in waves, showing her faces she had not seen in years and places she had never been. Sometimes she thought she heard footsteps on the porch, but when she forced her eyes open, there was nothing but the wind moving through the pines. She did not know that Vaughn Zeller had found her. Vaughn was a mountain man in the truest sense, a massive figure who stood 6'4" with shoulders broad enough to carry a deer across both of them. His hair fell past his shoulders in dark waves that he tied back with a strip of leather, and his arms were roped with muscle built from years of trapping, hunting, and surviving in country that broke weaker men. He had a face that might have been handsome if it were not so hard, all sharp angles and weathered skin, with eyes the color of storm clouds that seemed to see everything at once. He wore buckskin and fur even in summer, and he moved through the wilderness with the silence of smoke. He had been checking his trap lines when he noticed something wrong. Vaughn knew these mountains the way other men knew their own homes, every ridge and valley, every stream and game trail. He knew which cabins should have smoke rising from their chimneys and which ones stood empty. The Jensen cabin should have been quiet, the husband gone and the wife managing alone until his return. But there was smoke, thin and irregular, the kind that came from a fire that had not been properly tended. Vaughn had never met the Jensens personally, but he knew of them. New settlers, young and optimistic, the kind who thought love and determination could conquer anything. He had given them a year before they ran back to civilization, but they had surprised him by lasting through their first winter. That earned them a measure of respect in his estimation. He approached the cabin carefully, his rifle ready. Out here, caution kept a man alive. But when he reached the porch and heard the sound from inside, a low moan of pain that was unmistakably female, he did not hesitate. He pushed open the door and found her. Lydia lay on a narrow bed in the corner, her blonde hair dark with sweat, her face flushed with fever. She wore a simple cotton nightdress that clung to her thin frame, and her breathing came in shallow gasps. The cabin was stifling hot despite the open window, and the air smelled of sickness. Vaughn crossed the room in 3 long strides and pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. She was burning up, the fever so high he could feel the heat radiating from her skin. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. "Help," she whispered. "Please, I am here," Vaughn said. His voice was rough from disuse, deeper than thunder rolling through the mountains. "Where is your husband?" "Gone cattle drive. Will not be back until September." Vaughn cursed under his breath. It was late July. The woman would be dead long before September if she did not get help. He looked around the cabin and saw evidence of her attempts to care for herself. Empty water buckets, a pot of what might have been soup now cold and congealed, herbs scattered across the table, the wrong ones for fever. "How long have you been sick?" 3 days, maybe 4, I cannot remember. 3 days was too long. Vaughn had seen fever take people quickly in the mountains, especially when they were alone with no one to tend them. He made a decision in that moment that would change both their lives, though he did not know it yet. "I am going to get a doctor," he said. "There is one in Salt Lake City. I will bring him back." Lydia's eyes focused on him for the first time, really seeing him. She saw a giant of a man with kind eyes despite his harsh exterior, and she felt something loosen in her chest that might have been hope, or might have been the fever playing tricks on her mind. "Too far," she breathed. "You will never make it in time." "I will make it," Vaughn said. "You stay alive until I get back. That is an order." He did not wait for her response. He grabbed every blanket in the cabin and soaked them in the creek, then draped them over her burning body. He left a bucket of fresh water beside the bed and made sure the windows were open to let in air. Then he went to his horse, a massive bay stallion that could run for days without tiring, and he started riding. Vaughn rode like a man possessed. The trail from Taylorsville to Salt Lake City was 70 miles of mountain passes and narrow defiles where one wrong step could send horse and rider tumbling into oblivion. Most men took 3 days to make the journey, stopping to rest and water their horses, camping under the stars. Vaughn did not stop. He rode through the first night, the stars wheeling overhead as his horse's hooves pounded against the rocky trail. The stallion was a good animal, sure-footed and strong, and it seemed to sense the urgency in its rider. They climbed higher into the mountains, following switchbacks that hugged cliff faces, the drop on one side so steep that Vaughn could not see the bottom in the darkness. When dawn came, he was still riding, his eyes gritty with exhaustion but his mind sharp with purpose. He thought about the woman lying in that cabin, burning with fever, alone and afraid. He thought about her husband, who had left her to manage by herself in country that showed no mercy to mistakes. Vaughn felt anger rise in his chest at that, hot and unreasonable. What kind of man left his wife alone in the wilderness? But he pushed the anger aside. It did not matter now. All that mattered was getting the doctor and getting back before it was too late. The sun climbed higher and the temperature rose with it. Vaughn's throat was parched and his lips cracked, but he did not stop to drink. The stallion was lathered with sweat, its sides heaving, but it kept running. They descended from the high passes into valleys thick with sage and juniper, following the old wagon road that connected the scattered settlements. By the second night, Vaughn was hallucinating. He saw things moving in the shadows that were not there, heard voices calling his name from the darkness. His body ached in places he had not known could ache, and his hands were raw from gripping the reins. The stallion was struggling now, its gait uneven, but Vaughn pushed it on. He had no choice. He thought about Lydia's face, the way her eyes had focused on him with desperate hope. He barely knew her, had never spoken to her before that moment in the cabin, but something about her had grabbed hold of him and would not let go. Maybe it was the vulnerability, the trust she had placed in a stranger. Maybe it was something else, something he did not have words for. The third day was the hardest. Vaughn could barely stay in the saddle, his body swaying with exhaustion. He tied himself to the saddle horn with a length of rope so he would not fall off if he lost consciousness. The stallion was stumbling now, foam dripping from its mouth, but Salt Lake City was close. Vaughn could see the smoke from its chimneys rising in the distance. They rode into town just after noon on the third day. People stopped to stare at the wild-looking man on the half-dead horse, both of them covered in dust and sweat. Vaughn did not care. He rode straight to the doctor's office and slid from the saddle, his legs nearly buckling beneath him. He staggered to the door and pounded on it with his fist. The door opened to reveal a middle-aged man with a neat beard and spectacles, dressed in a clean suit that marked him as a professional. "Doctor," Vaughn said. His voice was a rasp, barely audible. "Need you, woman dying, Taylorsville, fever." The doctor took one look at Vaughn's face and nodded. "Let me get my bag." Vaughn tried to say something else, tried to explain the urgency, but the world tilted sideways. He felt himself falling and could not stop it. The last thing he said before the darkness took him was her name, Lydia. Then everything went black. When Vaughn woke, he was lying on a cot in the doctor's office with a blanket pulled over him. His head felt like someone had driven a spike through it, and his mouth tasted like old leather. He sat up slowly, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. "Easy there," a voice said. The doctor appeared beside him, holding a cup of water. "You have been out for 6 hours. Drink this slowly." Vaughn drank, the water like salvation flowing down his parched throat. "The woman," he said. "Lydia, we need to go." "We are going," the doctor said. "But you are not. You rode for 3 days without sleep. Your horse nearly died. You are in no condition to make the return journey." "I am going," Vaughn said. He tried to stand and his legs gave out. The doctor caught him and eased him back onto the cot. "You are not going anywhere except bed," the doctor said firmly. "I have already arranged for a guide to take me to Taylorsville, someone who knows the trails and has a fresh horse. You have done your part, now let me do mine." Vaughn wanted to argue, but he could barely keep his eyes open. The exhaustion was pulling at him like a physical weight, dragging him back down into darkness. He fought it for a moment longer, then surrendered. "Save her," he whispered. "I will do my best," the doctor said. Vaughn slept for 20 hours straight. When he finally woke again, the sun was streaming through the window and his head felt clearer. His body still ached, but it was a manageable pain now, not the bone-deep exhaustion that had consumed him before. He sat up and found his boots beside the cot, along with a note from the doctor. "Going to Taylorsville. We'll send word. Rest, you earned it." Vaughn crumpled the note in his fist. Resting was not something he did well. He needed to know if Lydia was alive, if the doctor had reached her in time. The uncertainty was worse than the exhaustion. He stood and tested his legs. They held. He walked to the window and looked out at Salt Lake City, a bustling town of several thousand people with wooden buildings and wide streets. It felt too crowded, too civilized. Vaughn belonged in the mountains, not here. But he could not leave, not until he knew. He spent the next 2 days in an agony of waiting. He checked on his horse, which was recovering in the livery stable, eating its weight in oats and hay. He bought new supplies and repaired his gear. He tried to distract himself with practical tasks. But his mind kept returning to that cabin and the woman lying in it. On the 3rd day, a rider came into town. He was young, barely 20, with a message from the doctor. Vaughn intercepted him before he could even dismount. "What news?" Vaughn demanded. The young man blinked at him in surprise. "You are Zeller, the mountain man who rode 3 days?" "The news," Vaughn said, his voice hard. "She is alive," the young man said. "The fever broke yesterday. The doctor says she will recover fully." Vaughn felt something in his chest release, a tension he had not realized he was carrying. "She is alive." "Yes, sir. Doc says you saved her life. Another day and she would have been gone." Vaughn nodded slowly. "Thank you." He walked away before the young man could say anything else, his mind already turning to the next problem. Lydia was alive, but she was still alone in that cabin with a husband who would not return for weeks. Someone needed to check on her, make sure she continued to recover. Someone needed to help her until she was strong enough to manage on her own again. Vaughn knew it should be someone else. He had already done more than most men would. But the thought of leaving her to fend for herself did not sit right with him. He made another decision, one that surprised him even as he made it. He would go back to Taylorsville. He would check on her, just to make sure she was truly all right. That was all. The return journey took 5 days because Vaughn let his horse set the pace, giving the animal time to recover fully before pushing it again. He arrived in Taylorsville on a warm August afternoon, the sky a brilliant blue overhead. He rode to the Jensen cabin and dismounted, suddenly uncertain in a way he had not been before. The door opened before he could knock. Lydia stood in the doorway, thinner than before but standing on her own, her blue eyes clear and bright. She wore a simple dress of faded calico, and her blonde hair was pulled back in a braid. She was beautiful in the way that mountains were beautiful, all natural grace and quiet strength. "You came back," she said. "I wanted to make sure you were healing," Vaughn said. "Come in," Lydia said. "Please." Vaughn followed her inside. The cabin was clean and orderly now, the smell of sickness replaced by the scent of fresh bread and wildflowers. Lydia had a kettle boiling on the stove and she poured 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Vaughn. "The doctor told me what you did," she said. "He said you rode for 3 days without stopping, that you nearly killed yourself getting to him." "It needed to be done," Vaughn said. "You did not even know me. Does that matter?" Lydia looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. "I suppose it does not, but I owe you my life." "You owe me nothing," Vaughn said. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Lydia said quietly. "They would not have. Most people would have helped as much as they could and then left me to my fate. You went beyond that. You risked everything." Vaughn did not know what to say to that, so he drank his coffee and looked around the cabin. "You are managing well on your own." "I am trying," Lydia said. "The doctor stayed for 3 days to make sure the fever did not return. He left me instructions and medicine. I am stronger every day." "Good." They fell into an awkward silence. Vaughn finished his coffee and stood. "I should go. I just wanted to check on you." "Wait," Lydia said. She stood as well, her hands twisting together nervously. "Would you stay? For supper, I mean. I made stew. It is the least I can do to thank you." Vaughn should have said no, should have ridden away and gone back to his solitary life in the mountains. But when he looked at Lydia's face, at the hope and loneliness there, he found himself nodding. "All right, for supper." Lydia's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. They ate together at the small table, and Vaughn found himself talking more than he had in years. Lydia asked him about his life in the mountains, about his trapping and hunting, and he told her stories that he had never told anyone else. She listened with genuine interest, laughing at the funny parts and gasping at the dangerous ones, and Vaughn discovered that he enjoyed making her react. She told him about her own life in turn, about growing up in Pennsylvania and meeting her husband at a church social, about how he had promised her adventure and a new life in the West, and how she had jumped at the chance to escape the suffocating expectations of her family. "Do you regret it?" Vaughn asked. "Coming out here sometimes," Lydia admitted, "when the winter gets so cold that the water freezes solid and I cannot see another human face for weeks. But mostly no, I love it here. The mountains, the space, the freedom. I just wish I were not alone so much." "Where is your husband now?" "Working a cattle drive through Wyoming. He will be gone until September, maybe longer. It is good money and we need it to make the ranch work. But I miss him." Vaughn heard something in her voice when she said that last part, something that did not quite ring true. He did not comment on it. When supper was finished, Vaughn stood to leave. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Lydia walked him to the door. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for saving me, and for staying tonight. It was nice to have company." You are welcome, Vaughn said. He paused, then added, I will check on you again in a few days. To make sure you are still healing. I would like that, Lydia said softly. Vaughn rode away as darkness fell, but he found himself looking back at the cabin until it disappeared into the trees. He told himself he was just being neighborly, making sure a woman alone in the wilderness had the help she needed. But deep down, in a place he did not want to examine too closely, he knew it was more than that. He came back 3 days later with a deer he had shot, the meat fresh and butchered. Lydia thanked him profusely and insisted he stay while she cooked it. They ate together again, and this time the conversation flowed even easier. Lydia told him about her dreams of building a real ranch, of raising horses and cattle, of making something lasting in this wild country. Vaughn found himself caught up in her enthusiasm, offering advice and suggestions based on his years in the mountains. He came back a week later with firewood, a whole cord of it that he chopped and stacked beside her cabin. Lydia brought him water and watched him work, admiring the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt, the easy strength with which he handled the heavy axe. When he was finished, she invited him inside for a cold drink, and they sat on her porch, talking until the stars came out. The visits became a pattern. Every few days, Vaughn would ride down from the high country with some excuse. He brought meat and fish. He repaired her roof where it was leaking. He showed her which herbs to gather and which ones to avoid. He taught her how to read the weather by watching the clouds, how to tell if a storm was coming by the behavior of the animals, and slowly, without either of them quite realizing it was happening, they fell in love. It started as friendship, a connection between two people who understood loneliness and the harsh beauty of the mountains. But it deepened with each visit, each shared meal, each long conversation. Vaughn found himself thinking about Lydia when he should have been focused on his trap lines. He found himself hurrying through his work so he could justify another visit to her cabin. Lydia found herself watching the trail, waiting for the sight of Vaughn riding toward her on his big bay stallion. She found herself taking extra care with her appearance, braiding her hair carefully and wearing her better dresses. She told herself it was just gratitude, just appreciation for his kindness. But she knew it was more than that. The realization hit Vaughn one evening in late August. He was sitting on Lydia's porch watching her feed the chickens she kept in a small coop behind the cabin. The setting sun turned her hair to gold, and she was humming a tune he did not recognize. She looked peaceful and happy, completely at home in this wild place, and Vaughn felt his heart clench in his chest. He loved her. He was in love with another man's wife. The knowledge should have sent him running. He should have mounted his horse and disappeared into the mountains, never to return. But he could not. The pull was too strong, the connection too deep. He was trapped, caught between what was right and what he wanted with every fiber of his being. Lydia came back to the porch and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. You are quiet tonight, she said. Just thinking, Vaughn said. About what? Nothing important. Lydia looked at him, really looked at him, and something passed between them, a recognition, an understanding. The air seemed to thicken, charged with possibility. Vaughn, Lydia said softly. She reached out and touched his hand where it rested on his knee. I need to tell you something. Do not, Vaughn said. His voice was rough. Do not say it. Why not? Because you are married. Because saying it will change everything. Everything is already changed, Lydia said. Do you not see that? Vaughn pulled his hand away and stood, walking to the edge of the porch. He gripped the railing so hard his knuckles turned white. Your husband will be back in a few weeks. I know. And then what? What happens then? I do not know, Lydia said. She stood and came to him, standing close behind him. I do not have answers, Vaughn. All I know is that when you are here, I feel alive in a way I have not felt in years. And when you leave, I count the hours until you come back. Vaughn turned to face her. This is wrong, is it? Lydia asked. Is it wrong to feel something real? To connect with someone who understands you? You made vows. I did, Lydia said quietly. And I have kept them. I have been a faithful wife. But Vaughn, I barely know my husband anymore. He is gone more than he is here. When he is here, we are like strangers sharing a house. There is no conversation, no connection. He does his work and I do mine, and we exist side by side without really seeing each other. That is not a reason to break your vows. I am not talking about breaking my vows, Lydia said. I am just being honest with you about how I feel. Vaughn looked down at her, at the earnest expression on her face, and felt his resolve crumbling. How do you feel? I think you know. Say it anyway. Lydia took a deep breath. I am falling in love with you, Vaughn Zeller. Maybe I have been since the moment you walked into that cabin and promised to save me. I know it is wrong. I know the timing is impossible, but it is the truth. Vaughn closed his eyes. Lydia. Tell me you do not feel the same, Lydia said. Tell me I am alone in this, and I will never mention it again. We can go back to being friends, nothing more. I cannot tell you that, Vaughn said. He opened his eyes and looked at her, because it would be a lie. The confession hung in the air between them. Lydia reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his bearded cheek. Vaughn covered her hand with his own, holding it there. "What do we do?" Lydia whispered. "I do not know," Vaughn said. "But we cannot act on this. Not while you are married. I know, when your husband returns, I will stay away. I will not come back here." "Vaughn, no, it is the only way," Vaughn said. "I will not be the man who destroys a marriage no matter how I feel." Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "That is not fair." "Life is not fair," Vaughn said. "If it were, I would have met you before you married someone else." He pulled away from her and walked down the porch steps to his horse. Lydia followed him, her voice breaking. "Do not leave like this, I have to," Vaughn said. He swung into the saddle and looked down at her. "I am sorry, Lydia, for all of it." He rode away into the gathering darkness, and Lydia stood in front of her cabin watching him go, tears streaming down her face. Vaughn did not come back for a week. He threw himself into his work with savage intensity, checking every trap line, hunting from dawn to dusk, pushing his body until he was too exhausted to think. But at night, lying in his bedroll under the stars, he could not stop his mind from returning to Lydia. He thought about her smile, her laugh, the way she looked at him like he was something precious. He thought about her husband too. A man Vaughn had never met but already resented. What kind of man left a woman like Lydia alone for months at a time? What kind of man did not see what a treasure he had? But that did not matter. Married was married. Vows were vows. Vaughn had lived his whole life by a code of honor, and he would not abandon it now, no matter how much it cost him. On the 8th day, he broke. He told himself he just needed to check on her one more time, make sure she was managing all right. But he knew he was lying to himself. He rode to her cabin with his heart pounding, uncertain of what he would find or what he would say. Lydia was sitting on the porch when he arrived, mending a shirt. She looked up at the sound of his horse, and her face transformed, joy and relief flooding her features. She set down her sewing and came to meet him. "I thought you were not coming back," she said. "I should not have," Vaughn said. He dismounted and stood before her, drinking in the sight of her. "But I could not stay away." "I am glad," Lydia said. "I have been miserable." "So have I." They stood looking at each other, the tension crackling between them. Finally, Lydia spoke. "I have made a decision." "What decision?" "When my husband returns, I am going to ask him for a divorce." Vaughn felt his heart stop. "Lydia, you cannot." "I can," Lydia said. "I have thought about nothing else for the past week. I have been unhappy in my marriage for a long time, Vaughn. Meeting you did not cause that. It just made me see it clearly. He will not agree to a divorce. No man would." "Then I will leave anyway," Lydia said. "I will go back east to my family. I will start over. But I cannot keep living a lie. I deserve more than a marriage in name only." "And what about me?" Vaughn asked. "Where do I fit into this?" "That is up to you," Lydia said. "I am not asking you to wait for me. I am not asking you for promises. I just needed you to know that I am choosing my own path, regardless of what happens between us." Vaughn stared at her, stunned by her courage. Most women would stay in an unhappy marriage because society demanded it, because leaving was scandalous and difficult. But Lydia was willing to risk everything for a chance at something better. "You are remarkable," he said. "I am just being honest," Lydia said. "Life is too short and too hard out here to waste it being unhappy." Vaughn stepped closer to her. "If you leave him, if you get your divorce, I will wait for you. However long it takes." "You mean that?" "I mean it," Vaughn said. "I love you, Lydia. I tried to fight it, tried to do the honorable thing, but I cannot deny it anymore. I love you." Lydia's face crumpled and she reached for him. Vaughn caught her in his arms and held her close, feeling her tears soak into his shirt. She clung to him like he was the only solid thing in a spinning world. "I love you too," she whispered against his chest. "I love you so much it scares me." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the fading light. Finally, Vaughn pulled back and looked down at her. "We still cannot be together, not until you are free." "I know," Lydia said, "but soon, it will be soon." Vaughn nodded. "I will wait, even if it takes years." "It will not," Lydia said. "I promise you, I will handle it as soon as he returns." They spent the evening together, talking about the future they might have. Vaughn told her about his plans to build a bigger cabin, maybe start a small ranch of his own. Lydia told him about her dreams of raising horses, of building something together. They talked until the moon rose high overhead, and when Vaughn finally left, they parted with the knowledge that they had turned a corner. There was no going back now. September came, and with it the return of Lydia's husband. Vaughn watched from a distance as Thomas Jensen rode up to the cabin, a man of average height with brown hair and a weathered face. Lydia came out to meet him, and Vaughn saw the stiffness in her posture, the lack of warmth in her greeting. She had been right. There was no love there. Vaughn did not approach the cabin while Thomas was there. He kept to the high country, checking his traps and hunting, but his mind was always on Lydia. He wondered how the conversation was going. If Thomas had agreed to the divorce, if Lydia was all right. 3 days after Thomas's return, a figure appeared on the trail leading up to Vaughn's camp. It was Lydia riding a small mare, her face determined. Vaughn met her halfway, his heart in his throat. "What happened?" he asked. "I told him," Lydia said. "I asked for a divorce, and he refused. He said I was his wife and I would remain his wife. He said he would never let me go." Vaughn felt anger rise in his chest, hot and fierce. "Did he hurt you?" "No," Lydia said. "But he was angry. He said terrible things. He blamed you, said you had turned me against him. I did not, I know. I told him that. I told him our marriage was broken long before you came into my life. But he would not listen. What are you going to do?" "I am leaving," Lydia said. "Tonight, I have packed what I can carry. I am going back east to my family. Once I am there, I will file for divorce through the courts. It will take time, but it can be done." Vaughn felt his world tilt. "You are leaving?" "I have to," Lydia said. "I cannot stay here with him, not now, not after everything. Let me come with you." "No," Lydia said firmly. "If you come with me, it will only make things worse. Thomas could accuse us of adultery and that would make the divorce impossible. I have to do this on my own." Vaughn wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he would protect her, but he knew she was right. "How long will it take?" 6 months, Lydia said. "Maybe a year. I do not know. But I will write to you. I will let you know where I am and how things are progressing." "I will wait," Vaughn said, "however long it takes." Lydia dismounted and came to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. Vaughn held her tight, breathing in the scent of her hair, memorizing the feel of her in his arms. "I love you," Lydia said. "Do not forget that. I could never forget." Vaughn said, "You are part of me now." They stood together until the light began to fade. Then Lydia pulled away, tears streaming down her face. "I have to go. He will notice I am gone soon." "Be safe," Vaughn said. "Write to me as soon as you can." "I will," Lydia promised. "Wait for me." "Vaughn, always," he said. She rode away into the twilight, and Vaughn watched until she disappeared. Then he returned to his camp and sat by his fire, staring into the flames and feeling more alone than he ever had in his life. The weeks that followed were the hardest Vaughn had ever endured. He continued his work trapping and hunting, but his heart was not in it. He thought about Lydia constantly, wondering where she was, if she had made it safely to her family. He imagined her traveling across the country, alone and vulnerable, and the worry gnawed at him. He went into Taylorsville occasionally for supplies, and on one of those trips he heard the talk. Thomas Jensen was telling everyone who would listen that his wife had run off with a mountain man, that Vaughn Zeller had seduced her and stolen her away. The rumors spread like wildfire, and Vaughn found himself the subject of hostile stares and muttered comments. He ignored them. The opinions of others had never mattered to him, and they did not matter now. All that mattered was Lydia, and keeping his promise to wait for her. The first letter came in October. Vaughn had arranged with the trading post owner to hold any mail for him, and when he rode down from the mountains on a cold autumn day, the man handed him a thin envelope with Lydia's neat handwriting on the front. Vaughn took it back to his camp and read it by firelight, his hands shaking slightly. "My dearest Vaughn," it began, "I have arrived safely at my sister's home in Philadelphia. The journey was long and difficult, but I made it without incident. My family was shocked to see me, and even more shocked when I told them I was seeking a divorce. But they are supporting me, which is more than I had hoped for. I have engaged a lawyer who specializes in such matters. He says the process will take at least 6 months, possibly longer. I must establish residency here, and Thomas must be formally notified. It is all very complicated and expensive, but I am determined to see it through. I miss you terribly. Every day I think about the mountains and our conversations on my porch. I think about your smile and the way you look at me like I am the only woman in the world. These memories sustain me through the difficult days. Be patient, my love. I am coming back to you. I promise. Yours always, Lydia." Vaughn read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket close to his heart. 6 months. He could wait 6 months. More letters came over the winter. Lydia wrote about her lawyer's progress, about the papers being drawn up and served to Thomas. She wrote about her life in Philadelphia, about how strange and confining the city felt after the open spaces of Utah. She wrote about missing him, about dreaming of the day they could be together. Vaughn wrote back, simple letters because writing was not something he did often or well. But he tried to tell her how he felt, how the mountains were empty without her, how he was counting the days until her return. Winter passed slowly. Vaughn spent most of it alone in the high country. His cabin snowed in for weeks at a time. He used the solitude to work on his plans. He sketched out designs for a bigger cabin, one with 2 rooms and a real fireplace. He thought about where he would put corrals for horses, how he would clear land for a garden. He was building a future in his mind. A future with Lydia. Spring came late in 1877, the snow lingering in the high passes well into April. Vaughn rode down to the trading post as soon as the trails were clear, hoping for another letter. There was one waiting for him, thicker than the others. He opened it with eager fingers and read, "My dearest Vaughn, I have wonderful news. The divorce has been granted. After months of legal wrangling, Thomas finally agreed to sign the papers. I am free. I am making arrangements to return to Utah immediately. I should arrive in Salt Lake City by mid-May. From there I will take the stage to Taylorsville. I cannot wait to see you again. All my love, Lydia. Vaughn let out a whoop that startled his horse. Free, she was free, and she was coming back. He spent the next weeks in a frenzy of preparation. He worked from dawn to dusk, clearing land, cutting timber, beginning the foundation for the new cabin. He wanted to have something to show her when she arrived, proof that he had been serious about building a life together. On the 15th of May, Vaughn rode into Salt Lake City. He told himself he was going for supplies, but really he just wanted to be there in case Lydia arrived early. He haunted the stage office, checking every day for arrivals from the east. On the 20th of May, his patience was rewarded. The stage rolled into town in a cloud of dust, and when the door opened, Lydia stepped out. She looked different. Thinner, paler, dressed in Eastern clothes that seemed too fine for the rough frontier town. But when her eyes found his in the crowd, her face lit up with such joy that Vaughn felt his heart expand in his chest. He pushed through the crowd and reached her in 3 long strides. She dropped her bag and threw her arms around his neck, and he lifted her off her feet, spinning her around as she laughed. You came, she said. Of course I came, Vaughn said. He set her down and looked at her, drinking in every detail. You are here. You are really here. I am here, Lydia said. And I am never leaving again. Vaughn kissed her then, right there in the street with dozens of people watching. He kissed her the way he had been dreaming of kissing her for months, pouring all his longing and love into it. Lydia kissed him back with equal fervor, her fingers tangling in his long hair. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Vaughn said, "Marry me." Lydia laughed, tears streaming down her face. Is that a proposal or a command? Both, Vaughn said. Marry me, Lydia, right now, today. I do not want to wait anymore. Yes, Lydia said. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. They were married that afternoon by a minister in Salt Lake City, with 2 strangers pulled off the street to serve as witnesses. It was the simplest ceremony imaginable, just a few words spoken in a plain office, but to Vaughn it was the most important moment of his life. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Vaughn kissed Lydia again, and she kissed him back with tears of joy on her face. They spent their wedding night in a hotel room in Salt Lake City, finally able to express physically what they had been feeling for so long. Vaughn was gentle with Lydia, treating her like something precious and fragile, and she responded with a passion that surprised them both. They made love slowly, learning each other's bodies, whispering words of love in the darkness. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Lydia's head on Vaughn's broad chest, his arms wrapped around her. I cannot believe this is real, Lydia said, that we are finally together. It is real, Vaughn said. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. You are mine now, legally and officially, and you are mine, Lydia said. No more waiting, no more wondering. Just us, Vaughn agreed. They left Salt Lake City the next morning, riding toward Taylorsville on Vaughn's bay stallion with Lydia seated in front of him, her back against his chest. They took their time on the journey, stopping to camp under the stars, making love by firelight, talking about their plans for the future. When they reached the area near Taylorsville, Vaughn did not take Lydia to her old cabin. Instead, he led her up a different trail, higher into the mountains, to a clearing beside a swift-running stream. There, the foundation of a new cabin stood, the logs already notched and ready to raise. This is where we will build our home, Vaughn said. If you approve. Lydia looked around at the clearing, at the mountains rising on all sides, at the meadow thick with wildflowers. Her eyes shone with tears. It is perfect, she said. Absolutely perfect. They spent the summer building their cabin together. Vaughn did the heavy work, raising the logs and notching them into place, while Lydia mixed the chinking and helped where she could. They worked from dawn to dusk, and in the evenings they would sit by their campfire and talk about the life they were creating. The cabin grew slowly but steadily. It was larger than Lydia's old place, with 2 rooms and a sleeping loft. Vaughn built a proper fireplace with river stones, and Lydia sewed curtains from fabric they bought in town. They made furniture together, a table and chairs, a bed frame for the thick mattress they stuffed with dried grass and wildflowers. By autumn, the cabin was finished. They moved in on a crisp September day, carrying their few possessions up the path. That night, they christened their new home properly, making love in front of the fireplace with the warmth of the flames washing over their bodies. Life settled into a rhythm. Vaughn continued his trapping and hunting, but now he had a reason to come home every night. Lydia kept the cabin, tended a garden, and began working with horses just as she had dreamed. She had a gift for it, Vaughn discovered, a natural ability to gentle even the wildest animals. They bought 3 mares in the spring of 1878 and began breeding them. Vaughn built corrals and a small barn, and Lydia trained the foals as they came. Within 2 years, they had a dozen horses and a reputation for quality stock. People came from all over the territory to buy Jensen Zeller horses. Yes, Jensen Zeller. Lydia had insisted on keeping her maiden name as part of their ranch name, a combination of both their identities. Vaughn had agreed without argument. He did not care what they called the place, as long as they built it together. They were happy. Deliriously, completely happy in a way that neither of them had thought possible. They worked hard during the days and loved each other fiercely at night. They laughed together, argued occasionally, made up thoroughly. They built a life that was rich in all the ways that mattered. In the spring of 1879, Lydia discovered she was pregnant. She told Vaughn one evening after supper, her hands trembling as she placed them on her belly. "We are going to have a baby," she said. Vaughn stared at her, the words not quite registering at first. Then understanding dawned, and his face split into the widest smile Lydia had ever seen. He crossed the room in 2 strides and swept her into his arms, holding her carefully as if she might break. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are having a baby. Are you happy?" Lydia asked. "Happy?" Vaughn laughed. "Lydia, I am more than happy. I am terrified and thrilled and grateful all at once." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Lydia continued to work with the horses through the summer, though Vaughn insisted she take it easier. He became ridiculously protective, forbidding her from lifting anything heavy or riding the wilder horses. Lydia found his protectiveness both annoying and endearing. As autumn approached and Lydia's belly grew round, Vaughn began to worry. The cabin was isolated, miles from any doctor. If something went wrong during the birth, he would not be able to get help in time. He mentioned this to Lydia one evening, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. "We should think about going to Salt Lake City when your time gets close," he said. "Stay with a doctor there, just to be safe." "No," Lydia said firmly. "I want to have our baby here in our home. Women have been giving birth in remote places since the beginning of time. I will be fine. You do not know that." "I do know it," Lydia said. She took his large hands and placed them on her belly, letting him feel the baby kick. "I am strong, Vaughn. You know that, and I have you. That is all I need." Vaughn wanted to argue, but he could see the determination in her eyes. "All right, but I will find a midwife to stay with us when the time comes. Someone with experience." "That is acceptable," Lydia said with a smile. But as November arrived and Lydia's time drew near, they discovered that the local midwife had moved away. The nearest one was in a settlement 20 miles distant, too far to be practical. Vaughn found himself in the impossible position of preparing to deliver his own child with no training and no help. He read every book he could find on childbirth, borrowing medical texts from the doctor in Salt Lake City. He gathered supplies, boiled water, prepared cloths and blankets. He did everything he could think of to be ready. But inside, he was terrified. Lydia went into labor on a cold November night. The first pains came just after midnight, waking her from sleep. She shook Vaughn awake. "It is time," she said. Vaughn bolted upright, his heart racing. "Are you sure?" "I am sure," Lydia said. She gasped as another contraction hit. "Oh yes, I am very sure." Vaughn moved into action, doing everything he had prepared to do. He built up the fire to keep the cabin warm. He boiled water and laid out clean linens. He helped Lydia into a nightgown and settled her on the bed, holding her hand through the contractions. The labor went on for hours. Dawn came and went. The contractions grew stronger and closer together, and Lydia cried out with the pain despite her efforts to stay quiet. Vaughn felt utterly helpless, able to do nothing but hold her hand and whisper encouragement. By midday, Vaughn was seriously worried. Lydia was exhausted, her face pale and drawn, and the baby still had not come. He kept checking the way the books had described, but there was no sign of the baby crowning yet. "Something is wrong," Lydia gasped between contractions. "It should not be taking this long." "You are doing fine," Vaughn said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "First babies take time." The books said that. But privately he was starting to panic. What if something really was wrong? What if the baby was breached, or there were other complications he did not know how to handle? He had never felt so inadequate in his life. As the afternoon wore on and Lydia's strength began to fail, Vaughn made a decision. He could not do this alone. He needed help. Real, professional help. "I am going to get the doctor," he said. "No," Lydia said weakly. "Do not leave me." "I have to," Vaughn said. "Lydia, listen to me. I do not know what I am doing. If something goes wrong, I cannot help you. I need to get the doctor from Salt Lake City." "That is 70 miles, Lydia said. "You will never make it in time." "I will make it," Vaughn said. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "You stay strong. I will be back before you know it." "Vaughn," Lydia said, fear in her eyes. "Trust me," Vaughn said. "I rode 3 days to save you once before. I will do it again." He left her there, hating himself for it, but knowing it was the only choice. He saddled his stallion and rode down the mountain at a pace that bordered on reckless. The horse seemed to sense the urgency and gave everything it had, its hooves pounding against the trail. Vaughn rode through the night without stopping. He rode through the next day, pushing the stallion to its limits. He did not think about the exhaustion dragging at him or the fear gnawing at his gut. He thought only about Lydia, alone and in pain, needing him to come through for her. He reached Salt Lake City in the early morning of the third day, half dead from lack of sleep but still upright in the saddle. He went straight to the doctor's office and pounded on the door. The same doctor who had saved Lydia before answered, older now but still sharp-eyed. He took one look at Vaughn and said, "Your wife?" "In labor," Vaughn said. His voice was a rasp. 2 days now. Something is wrong. Need you. "Let me get my bag," the doctor said. They rode back together, the doctor on a fresh horse from the livery. Vaughn's stallion was nearly spent, but it kept going, sensing that the journey was not over yet. They made good time, better than Vaughn had dared hope. They reached the cabin on the afternoon of the third day. Vaughn dismounted and ran inside, terrified of what he might find. Lydia was still alive, still conscious, though barely. She lay on the bed, her nightgown soaked with sweat, her face gray with exhaustion. When she saw Vaughn, she managed a weak smile. "You came back," she whispered. "I will always come back," Vaughn said. He knelt beside the bed and took her hand. "The doctor is here. He is going to help you." The doctor swept into the cabin and immediately took charge. He examined Lydia quickly, his face serious but not panicked. "The baby is breached," he said. "That is why the labor has been so difficult. I am going to have to turn it." "Can you?" Vaughn asked. "Yes," the doctor said, "but it will not be pleasant for your wife." "Do what you have to do," Lydia said. Her voice was faint but determined. "Just save my baby." The doctor worked quickly and expertly, his experienced hands knowing exactly what to do. Lydia cried out with the pain, and Vaughn held her, whispering words of comfort and strength. Within minutes, the doctor had turned the baby into the correct position. "Now push," he commanded. "When the next contraction comes, push with everything you have." Lydia pushed. She pushed with the last of her strength, drawing on reserves she did not know she possessed. Vaughn supported her, his strong arms holding her upright, his voice in her ear telling her she could do this. And then, after what seemed like an eternity but was probably only minutes, a baby's cry filled the cabin. Sharp and strong, the most beautiful sound Vaughn had ever heard. "It is a girl," the doctor said, holding up the squalling infant. "A healthy baby girl." Vaughn felt tears streaming down his face. A girl. They had a daughter. He looked at Lydia and saw the same tears on her cheeks, but these were tears of joy and relief. The doctor cleaned the baby and wrapped her in a soft blanket, then placed her in Lydia's arms. Lydia looked down at her daughter with such love that Vaughn felt his heart might burst. "She is perfect," Lydia whispered. "She is," Vaughn agreed. He touched the baby's tiny hand with one rough finger, marveling at how small and delicate she was. "What should we name her?" "Hope," Lydia said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope, because she represents everything I hoped for when I thought I would die alone in these mountains. A family, a future. Love, Hope Zeller," Vaughn said. He kissed his wife's forehead, then his daughter's. "Welcome to the world, little one." The doctor stayed for 2 days to make sure both mother and baby were recovering well. Lydia was exhausted but healthy, and baby Hope was thriving, nursing eagerly and sleeping peacefully in her parents' arms. When the doctor prepared to leave, Vaughn walked him outside. "I owe you a debt I can never repay," he said. "Again, you do not owe me anything," the doctor said. "Well, except my fee, but we can settle that later. You did the hard part, Vaughn. You rode 3 days without sleep to fetch me. You did what needed to be done. If I had waited too long," Vaughn could not finish the sentence. "But you did not," the doctor said. "Trust your instincts. They have not led you wrong yet." After the doctor left, Vaughn returned to the cabin to find Lydia nursing Hope by the fire. He sat beside them, wrapping his arm around his wife's shoulders, and looked at his daughter's tiny face. "I almost lost you both," he said quietly. "But you did not," Lydia said. "You saved us. Just like you saved me that first time. I will always save you," Vaughn said. "That is my job now, keeping you and Hope safe. We are lucky to have you," Lydia said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I love you, Vaughn Zeller. Thank you for riding 3 days for me. Again." "I would ride 300 days for you," Vaughn said. 1,000, whatever it takes. They sat together as the fire crackled and their daughter slept, 3 people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch prospered, with their horses becoming known throughout the territory for their quality and temperament. Vaughn and Lydia worked side by side, raising their daughter and building their business. They added on to the cabin, giving Hope her own room, and eventually building a proper barn and bunkhouse for the ranch hands they hired as the operation grew. Hope grew into a spirited little girl with her mother's blonde hair and her father's gray eyes. She learned to ride before she could walk properly, and by the age of 5 she was helping her parents with the horses, fearless and confident. Vaughn adored her, this tiny human who had him wrapped around her finger from the moment of her birth. When Hope was 3, Lydia gave birth to a son. This time the labor was easier, and with a midwife in attendance there were no complications. They named him Vance, and he grew into a sturdy boy with his father's broad shoulders and quiet nature, 2 years later came another daughter, Grace, who was sweet-tempered and gentle with a gift for singing. And finally, when Lydia was 32, they had their last child, a son they named Luke, who was wild and reckless and kept them all on their toes. The cabin was always full of noise and laughter, children running in and out, horses whinnying in the corrals, dogs barking as they chased the chickens. It was chaos and joy and everything Vaughn had never known he wanted. On summer evenings, when the work was done and the children were finally in bed, Vaughn and Lydia would sit on their porch and watch the sun set behind the mountains. They would hold hands and talk about their day, about the children's antics and the ranch's progress, about nothing and everything. "Do you ever regret it?" Vaughn asked one evening. They had been married for 15 years, and he still sometimes marveled that she had chosen him. "Giving up your old life, dealing with the scandal, coming back here to live in the wilderness?" "Never," Lydia said. She turned to look at him, her blue eyes still as bright as the day he had first seen her. "You gave me everything I ever wanted, Vaughn. A real home, children, a partnership, love. How could I regret any of that?" "Some women would want more," Vaughn said. "A house in town, fine clothes, society." "I am not some women," Lydia said. "I am me, and this is exactly where I want to be." Vaughn pulled her close and kissed her, still amazed after all these years at the miracle of her presence in his life. "I love you," he said against her lips. "I love you too," Lydia said. "My mountain man, my hero, my husband." They sat together as the stars came out, two people who had found each other in the wilderness and built something that would last forever. Their children slept safe in their beds, their horses grazed peacefully in the meadow, and the mountains stood eternal and unchanging around them, bearing witness to a love story that had begun with a desperate ride and a whispered name. The ranch continued to grow over the years. By the time Hope was 10, they were running cattle as well as horses, with 100 head grazing in the mountain meadows. Vaughn hired experienced ranch hands to help with the work, and Lydia managed the books and correspondence. Proving to have a keen head for business, the children grew and thrived. Hope became an accomplished rider, winning competitions in Salt Lake City and earning a reputation as the best horsewoman in the territory. Vance was quieter but no less capable, showing a gift for working with his hands and building things. Grace loved books and learning, and Lydia taught her to read and write, dreaming of the day when they might send her to a proper school. Luke was the baby, spoiled and doted on by his entire family, but somehow still managing to be charming rather than insufferable. As the children got older, Vaughn and Lydia began to tell them the story of how they met. How Vaughn had found Lydia burning with fever and had ridden 3 days to fetch the doctor. How he had collapsed at the doctor's door and said her name. How they had fallen in love despite all the obstacles in their path. The children loved the story, begging to hear it over and over. Hope particularly was fascinated by it, romanticizing her parents' courtship in the way that young girls do. "Tell me again about when Papa rode 3 days without sleeping," she would beg. "Tell me about how he saved Mama." And Vaughn would tell it, though he always downplayed his own role, focusing instead on Lydia's strength and courage. He did not think of himself as a hero. He had just done what needed to be done, the same as any man would for the woman he loved. But Lydia saw it differently. She knew that not every man would have done what Vaughn did. Not every man would have risked his own life for a woman he barely knew. Not every man would have waited faithfully for months while she worked through her divorce. Not every man would have loved her so completely and thoroughly that she felt cherished every single day. Vaughn was extraordinary, even if he did not see it himself. And Lydia made sure their children knew it, that they understood what kind of man their father was. As the years passed, Taylorsville grew from a scattered collection of homesteads into a proper town. More settlers arrived, attracted by the good land and the promise of prosperity. A church was built, and then a school, and eventually even a small bank. The Zellers were respected members of the community, known for their honest dealing and hard work. Thomas Jensen had left the territory years before, moving to Colorado to start over. Lydia heard occasional news of him through mutual acquaintances. He had remarried and had children of his own. She felt no animosity toward him anymore, just a distant sort of pity for the man he had been and the marriage that had failed. That part of her life felt like it belonged to a different person, someone she barely remembered being. When Hope turned 18, a young man from a neighboring ranch began courting her. His name was Samuel Wright, and he was everything parents could want for their daughter. Hardworking, respectful, honest, with a good ranch of his own to inherit. Hope was clearly smitten, and Samuel looked at her the way Vaughn looked at Lydia, with undisguised adoration. Vaughn found it difficult to accept that his little girl was grown and ready to marry. He growled and muttered and gave Samuel a hard time, testing the young man to make sure he was worthy. But Lydia just laughed at his posturing. "You are being ridiculous," she told him one night after Samuel had left following supper. "That boy is terrified of you." "Good," Vaughn said. "He should be. If he is going to marry my daughter, he needs to prove he can handle the pressure. He loves her, Lydia said. Can you not see that? He looks at her the way you looked at me. Vaughn softened at that. I suppose he does. And Hope loves him back, Lydia continued. They are good together. Let them be happy. So Vaughn relented, and the following spring Hope and Samuel were married in the church in Taylorsville. It was a beautiful ceremony with half the territory in attendance. Hope looked radiant in a dress Lydia had sewn for her, and Samuel could not take his eyes off his bride. During the reception, Vaughn found himself standing alone for a moment, watching his daughter dance with her new husband. Lydia appeared at his side and slipped her hand into his. She is not gone, Lydia said gently. She is just starting her own life, the way we did. I know, Vaughn said. It is just hard to let go. It is, Lydia agreed, but we still have 3 more at home. They will keep us busy for a long time yet. Vaughn smiled at that. You are right, and we have each other. That is what matters most. Always, Lydia said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the same gesture she had made 1,000 times before. We have been very lucky, Vaughn, to find each other, to build this life. Lucky, Vaughn repeated. He thought about that day so many years ago when he had found a fevered woman in a cabin and made the decision to save her. He thought about the 3-day ride, the collapse at the doctor's door, the moment when he had whispered her name before losing consciousness. He thought about everything that had come after, the love and the struggle and the triumph. Maybe it was not luck, he said. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was both, Lydia said. Does it matter? No, Vaughn said. I suppose it does not. They stood together watching their daughter dance, surrounded by their family and friends, the mountains rising eternal in the distance. 2 people who had beaten the odds, who had chosen each other despite everything standing in their way, who had built a love that would endure for generations. The years continued to pass in the gentle rhythm of ranch life. Vance married a girl from town and took over more of the ranch operations, proving to have inherited his father's skill with horses and his mother's business sense. Grace surprised everyone by becoming a teacher, running the school in Taylorsville and earning a reputation as strict but fair. Luke, true to his wild nature, became a guide, leading hunting parties into the high country and loving every minute of it. Vaughn and Lydia grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies showing the wear of hard physical labor and mountain living. But their love never diminished. If anything, it grew deeper and richer with time, seasoned by shared experiences and mutual respect. They became grandparents, then great-grandparents, watching their family tree spread and flourish. The ranch house was always full during holidays, children and grandchildren crowding around the table, laughing and telling stories. Vaughn would sit at the head of the table with Lydia beside him, looking around at the faces of their descendants, marveling at what they had created. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party. The whole town came, along with people from neighboring settlements. There was food and music and dancing, speeches and toasts. Hope stood up and told the story of how her parents met, embellishing it slightly for dramatic effect, making everyone laugh and cry in equal measure. When it was Vaughn's turn to speak, he stood and pulled Lydia to her feet beside him. He looked at her, this woman who had been the center of his world for 3 decades, and felt the same surge of love he had felt that first day. I am not good with words, he said to the assembled crowd, never have been. But I want to say something about this woman beside me. 30 years ago, I found her dying in a cabin. I rode 3 days to fetch a doctor. I did not know her then, had never spoken to her. But something told me she was worth saving, and I was right. She was worth that ride and 1,000 more. She has made my life richer and fuller than I ever imagined possible. She gave me children and a home and a purpose. She taught me that love is not just a feeling, it is a choice you make every day. And every day for 30 years I have chosen her, and I will keep choosing her until the day I die. There was not a dry eye in the room. Lydia was crying openly, and Vaughn gently wiped away her tears with his thumbs. I love you, she said. I love you too, Vaughn replied. Always have, always will. They kissed, and the room erupted in applause and cheers. As they grew older, Vaughn and Lydia gradually handed over more of the ranch operations to their children. They still worked, still helped out where they could, but they also took time to simply enjoy each other's company. They would take long rides into the mountains together, just the 2 of them like in the old days, camping under the stars and remembering their youth. On one such trip, when they were both in their 60s, they returned to the place where Lydia's old cabin had stood. The structure had long since collapsed, reclaimed by the wilderness, but they could still see the outline of where it had been, and the memories came flooding back. I was so scared, Lydia said, standing in what had once been her front yard. I really thought I was going to die alone in that cabin. But you did not, Vaughn said. I found you. You did, Lydia agreed. She turned to look at him. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not checked those trap lines that day? If you had not noticed the smoke from the chimney? No, Vaughn said. Because I did check them. I did notice. Some things are meant to be. You saved my life that day, Lydia said. In more ways than one, and you saved mine, Vaughn said. You gave me a reason to come down from the mountains, a reason to build something instead of just surviving. You made me whole. They stood together in the ruins of the past, two old people holding hands, remembering the journey that had brought them here. Then they mounted their horses and rode back to their ranch, to their family, to the life they had built together. Vaughn Zeller died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, with Lydia holding his hand. It was a cold winter night, and he had been feeling tired for weeks, his great strength finally beginning to fail. But he had lived a full life, richer than most men could ever dream of. At his funeral, the church was packed to overflowing. People came from all over the territory to pay their respects to the mountain man who had become a pillar of the community. His children and grandchildren spoke, sharing stories of his kindness and strength, his humor and wisdom, but it was Lydia who had the last word. She stood at the front of the church, a tiny elderly woman with white hair and a straight spine, and she spoke with a clear, strong voice. My husband was not a complicated man, she said. He did not need much to be happy. Just the mountains he loved, work to occupy his hands and his family around him. But he loved with a depth and devotion that few people ever achieve. When he loved completely, without reservation or doubt. And I was blessed to be the recipient of that love for 42 years. He saved my life once, riding 3 days without sleep to fetch a doctor when I was dying of fever. But really, he saved my life every day after that just by being who he was. A good man, a faithful husband, a devoted father. He made me better than I would have been without him. He gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams. I will miss him every day for the rest of my life, but I am grateful beyond measure for the time we had. And I know that wherever he is now, he is at peace because he lived without regrets and loved without limits. Lydia lived for another 6 years after Vaughn's death. She stayed on the ranch, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, still riding her horse when the weather was good, still overseeing the business of the ranch. She never remarried. How could she, when she had already had the love of a lifetime? When she finally passed quietly in her sleep at the age of 82, her family buried her beside Vaughn on a hill overlooking their ranch. The headstone was simple. Lydia Jensen Zeller, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She lived without fear and loved without limits. And below it, Vaughn's stone. Vaughn Zeller, beloved husband, father, and grandfather. He rode 3 days to save her life, and she made his life worth living. Their story became legend in the territory, passed down through generations. The tale of the mountain man who rode 3 days without sleep to fetch a doctor, who collapsed at the door and said her name, who fell in love with the woman he saved and built a life that became the envy of all who knew them. Their ranch still stands, run now by their great-great-grandchildren, the Jensen Zeller name still known throughout Utah for quality horses and honest dealing. And sometimes on quiet summer evenings, when the work is done and the sun is setting behind the mountains, you can almost see 2 figures sitting on the porch of the old house, holding hands and watching the stars come out, still together even after all these years. Because true love does not end with death. It echoes through generations, a legacy of devotion and sacrifice and unwavering commitment. Vaughn and Lydia proved that love can overcome any obstacle, that 2 people from different worlds can find each other and build something beautiful together. Their story is a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism are not performed on battlefields or in moments of dramatic rescue. Sometimes heroism is simply showing up, day after day, choosing to love and be loved, building a life together brick by brick and moment by moment. Vaughn Zeller rode 3 days to save Lydia Jensen's life. And in return, she gave him a life worth living, a love worth dying for, and a legacy that would endure long after they were both gone. Their love story began with a desperate ride through mountain wilderness and a name whispered at a doctor's door. It grew through struggle and sacrifice, through patience and perseverance. And it ended, decades later, with 2 old people who had lived fully and loved completely, who had no regrets and no unfinished business, who had built something that would last forever. That is the real magic of their story. Not the dramatic rescue or the 3-day ride, but the everyday choosing of each other, the small acts of kindness and devotion that added up over years and decades into something extraordinary. Because in the end, that is what love is. Not a single grand gesture, but 1,000 small ones. Not a moment, but a lifetime. Not luck or fate, but choice and commitment. Vaughn and Lydia chose each other every single day for more than 40 years. And that choice transformed both their lives, and the lives of everyone who came after them. Their descendants still tell the story, still point to the headstones on the hill, still ride through the mountains and remember the mountain man and the woman he saved. The 3-day ride. The name whispered at the door. The love that conquered everything. It is a story that belongs to the Old West. to a time when life was hard and love was simple and people were measured by their actions rather than their words. It is a story that reminds us what is possible when two people decide that they are worth fighting for, that love is worth the risk. And it is a story that will be told as long as those mountains stand, as long as there are people who believe in the power of love to transform lives and create miracles. Vaughn and Lydia, the mountain man and his wife. A love story for the ages, born in the wilderness of Utah Territory in the summer of 1876, and still alive in the hearts of their descendants today. They lived, they loved, they built something beautiful together. And that is the happiest ending of all.